Chapter 1. Wanting her was dangerous. She was not of his kind, and if she learned what he was, she could put the pack at risk. Yet desire waylaid him each time he caught her scent. Aidan Wallace listened intently as Emma Gavin, her cute, blonde self tucked into a red dress, read from her latest book, Night Shift. Emma always kicked off the first 2 times he'd come as a fan, intrigued by this petite 28. Writers got it all wrong. But her accuracy had a downside. For this Wednesday night event he wasn't here as a fan. Instead he was attending in his role as chief security officer for the Wallace pack. Howard Wallace, the Alpha and Aidan's father, worried. Contact with somebody on the inside, that kind of leak had the power to destroy the pack. Surveillance. So far he'd turned up nothing, but his father wanted him to stay on the job. When Emma left on her book tour, Aidan would follow, although he would manage with business interests that stretched from Park Avenue to Yorkers might panic if they learned that a sizable chunk of the city was owned. He was near. Emma paused and ran her tongue nervously over her lips. She'd rather have been alone in her loft, curled up in a cozy chair with a book, or meet today's deadline for the next book in the series. Most definitely last night, when she was pushing toward the finish. Aidan had pondered that while reading Night Shift recently. He'd been privy. Aidan would like to believe he wasn't drawn to it, that he viewed the subject intellectually. That wasn't quite true. Over her breasts and hips he couldn't allow himself to fantasize. His groin tightened, and he glanced away, irritated with his automatic response to her. He concentrated on the uncomfortable nature of the metal folding chair. The manufacturer hadn't created this chair with a 6'4", 200-pound. Complaining about the chair did the trick, and he was able to return his. Brunette in a black suit hovered nearby. Aidan pegged her as somebody from the publishing house who'd come along to facilitate the signing gig. Life. As would he. The crown prince of the Wallace pack was expected to choose well. Great werewolf families based in North America. His brother Rourke might. Barring some misstep, he'd end up with Nadia Henderson, daughter of Leland. Him sexually, but that wasn't the point. Uniting the New York and Chicago of her. At 32 he was fast approaching the time when he'd have to. Distracted by that thought, he missed the end of the reading and the beginning of the autographing session. A line had formed by the time Aidan stood and copy before handing it back to the buyer. Topcoat over one arm, Aidan headed to the back of the group. He hated lines. He hadn't sensed any other werewolves in the crowd, which was a disappointment. He'd thought her informant, if she had one, would want to. Of course, Betty Gavin had taken a chair in front and was near the head of the line. Daughter, but the resemblance was striking. She worked as an administrative and hadn't found anything suspicious. Obviously she thought her daughter had. Aidan settled in to wait and tried to block out the sensory overload created. And shuffling feet battered his eardrums. He longed for the stillness of the forest or the hushed ambience he'd achieved. To give him the illusion of the deep woods, even in the heart of the city, and silence was another thing he appreciated about Emma. She didn't make some sexy dance moves that he'd have been wise to forget about. She didn't wear perfume either, which allowed him to pick up her true scent. Her beguiling aroma reached out to him, penetrating the maze of competing scents, taunting him from 30 feet away. He'd met her up close only twice. She'd asked enough questions to find out he was a member of the well-connected Wallace family. She'd seemed a little surprised yet pleased that Aidan read handful of men in the audience. He'd bet he was the only one who knew how she bet Hunter Green. Seeing her tonight was a completely different experience for 3 months, he and his staff had monitored her activities through wiretaps and hidden cameras in her loft. He'd personally followed her whenever. Girlfriend. 20s. She was an environmentalist, which prompted her to take public too much of it, which had turned her into an insomniac. Or maybe it was all the organic chocolate she ate along with the coffee. More than once he'd choice of boyfriend. As he moved closer to the signing table and the pull of pheromones grew stronger, his thoughts understandably turned to her sex life. Creative sex scenes that left him hard and aching would require a dynamite. Doug had spent the night at Emma's loft exactly 4 times in 3 months. Aidan had balked at putting a camera in her bedroom, both to respect her. Picked up the sounds of a couple having sex in the bedroom. Sad to say he. Stale bagel. Emma deserved somebody more inspired, somebody more ardent. Aidan wondered. Search out a better alternative to Doug. Then, too, her taxes were probably. As Aidan contemplated Emma's sorry excuse for a sex life, Betty Gavin walked. Guilty as charged. Her books. I think she's proud of that. Aidan shook her hand and took note that Betty had a firm grip. His contacts had assured him that, in the office where she worked, she was a force to be reckoned with. Your daughter's a gifted writer. Don't know where she gets all those ideas. Couldn't say that. I guess she's just creative. Yes, she certainly is. Betty looked over toward the bookstore entrance. I was so hoping Doug would surprise her at the last minute and show up. Gee, you would think so, wouldn't you? Emma just finished a book early this morning, and she likes to celebrate after turning in a manuscript. I wish maybe her boyfriend will show up. Aidan wondered how tuned in the guy could. Maybe he will. Anyway, I have to go. Betty patted his arm. It's almost your that. She walked away clutching her book. Her daughter's career. He admired that kind of loyalty. Left him as the only autograph seeker in the vicinity. Emma's scent hit him. Completely. He would be careful. Aidan Wallace. Emma smiled as she stood and held out her hand. I saw you in the audience and I was hoping you'd stick around. Sandwiched it between both of his. Not good. He released her hand and cleared his throat. Congratulations on your new book. She needed a vacation, not a book tour. He thought of his ancestral home near Sitka, Alaska. The remote lodge surrounded by cozy log cabins was his. So instead he made pleasant conversation. I hear you're headed off to Chicago. In a few days. Right. Her enthusiasm didn't ring true, but if she dreaded the tour, she turned to the woman in black. Ginny, this is Aidan Wallace. Aidan, Ginny. Dunn handles PR for the company, and was kind enough to come with me tonight. It's the least I could do, considering how hard Emma works. Ginny shook. Aidan nodded. He and Roger Claymore go way back. Father should have snagged you an advance copy of the book. And you're still buying one? She pushed it gently back toward him. You. Yeah, Ido. He gave the book a nudge back in her direction. The copy I read was one of those softcover deals, and he'd marked it up looking for clues. Bookshelf. Had been primarily to see whether any werewolf showed up. Ginny began gathering bookmarks and flyers from the table. I hope you too. And thanks so much for being here. That email I got late this afternoon. Aidan was proud of his casual response, considering the alarm bells clanging in his head. His crew had been monitoring her emails several times a day, but since nothing interesting had popped up, he told them to cut back. Werewolf is like, holy shit. Aidan did his best to stay calm. Sounds like a nut. Or some lonely soul trying to get a date. She smiled at him. I guess he imagines I actually believe in werewolves. She went back to autographing his book. The day I start believing in the fantasy I created is the day they'll have to chase after me with a butterfly. Aidan mentally sighed in relief. He was good at reading people, and Emma, except for one thing, she might have attracted the attention of a rogue after all. That email was sort of creepy though. Jenny tucked all the publicity materials into a satchel and hooked the straps over her shoulder. We can. Completely okay with that. Send me. Aidan saw a golden opportunity and vowed to take advantage of it. At each stop, the hotels are secure. I'm not worried. Hands on it in the worst way. He could notify his tech guys to pull it up, but going through Emma might be the simplest. A plan was forming in his mind. We tried, Ginny said. I handle security for Wallace Enterprises. I might be able to figure it out. Somehow I thought you were on Wall Street. I have a cousin who is, but I went a different route. I'm thrilled he's in security, Jenny said. If you'll give me your email address, Aidan, I'll send over what Emma forwarded to me. The guy's probably harmless kook, but if we could pinpoint where he is, that would be valuable. Aidan pulled out a business card from an inside pocket of his suit jacket and handed it to Jenny. Considering my dad's history with Roger Claymore, the service will be gratis. He'd play this as if he needed Jenny's cooperation to get that email. You should charge your regular fee. Emma finished the autograph and closed the book. If they were going to send somebody along on the tour, they can certainly afford your expert advice. It won't take long enough to justify a bill. Aidan was still planning to. She was ill-prepared to confront a werewolf. No good could come of it either. For her or for the packs living in various North American cities. I appreciate the offer. Jenny accepted the card and tucked it into her pocket. I'll send the email first thing in the morning. Emma, take a cab. Home. I have a car and driver, Aidan said, knowing she wouldn't approve of his. I'll see that she gets home safely. Emma glanced up at him. Thank you, but that's not necessary. Eminência. Jenny sent her a pointed look. A security expert who also happens to be a Wallace and who loves your books, has offered to run a trace on that email for free, and now he's prepared to get you home safely. As a representative of your publisher, I insist you accept that offer. Okay, but I think it's kind of silly. Humor me. All right. Jenny nodded. With a wave she walked away. There you go. Emma pushed the book back across the table. And you certainly don't have to chauffeur me home tonight. You must have a million things to do that are more important. Can't think of any. He put on his topcoat before picking up the book. Are you ready to go? He was still sorting through the possibilities of the email. The sender could be a nutcase or a werewolf willing to betray his pack to impress a woman, which made him a werewolf nutcase. Either way, his behavior could be unpredictable. She sighed and her shoulders dropped. Luxury car instead of a taxi. Greenhouse gases then the taxi, and it's been a long day. Following a long night. He'd kept track of her through most of it, and she'd spent the wee hours finishing her manuscript instead of sleeping. Let me call Ralph. He pulled his BlackBerry from inside his jacket and speed-dialed his. Yes, I'm ready. I have a passenger to drop off in the village. Then he cringed. He wasn't supposed to know where she lived. He hoped she was too tired to notice the slip. Now he had to hope Ralph would remember to ask her for the address as if he didn't know it. If Aidan had been in wolf form, he could have sent Ralph a telepathic message, but in human form he had to rely on his cell. I do appreciate this. Standing, Emma grabbed her coat and purse from a neighboring chair before walking around the table to join him. I love meeting readers, but my cheeks hurt from smiling. I'll bet. Let me help you with your coat. Oh. She looked a little disoriented but handed it over and set her purse on the table so he could slide the coat over her arms and onto her shoulders. Although manners had been heavily ingrained in Aidan since a young age, he wasn't in the habit of lying to himself. Manners hadn't been his main reason for helping her with the coat. He'd wanted the chance to move closer, to let his fingers brush the red silk of her dress, to feel the warmth of her body swirl as the coat went on. None of that fit into his plan to be careful. When she lifted her blonde hair, vulnerable spot, and swallowed, he wanted her too much. He should turn this job over to one of his capable staff members, but he knew he wouldn't. Thank you. She glanced back at him. You have an old-world charm about you. It's nice. Nice. If she only knew the thoughts he was having, the growl of primitive need he was choking back. I'm sure you're tired. We should get going. I am tired. But I can hardly complain. Success doesn't come along every day. He followed as they wound their way through the book aisles. I've often wondered if readings are stressful for writers. And Dougie Boy hadn't shown celebration. The more he learned about the guy, the less he liked him. The extroverts don't mind them, I suppose, but for introverts like me it can be a challenge sometimes. Apparently she wasn't that tired if she'd picked up on his slip. He'd have to lie. Must have read it in an interview somewhere. That's possible. I've asked reporters not to mention stuff like that, but fortunately I don't have a huge problem with people pestering me. I promise not to pester you. He planned to stick to her like fur to polyester. He doubted the email she'd received had come from anyone in the Wallace pack. The Wallaces had some interesting family dynamics, and not everyone got along, but nobody would take the chance of sabotaging the whole. He suspected the rogue, if that's who had sent the email, belonged to another. The entire book tour. His father could talk Roger Claymore into it by giving the publisher a smoking rate for Aidan's services. There was a good chance that when Emma left for Chicago, Aidan would be on the plane with her, unless someone in the family figured out that he craved this woman. Then he'd have to take himself off the case. He rebelled at that idea, even as he acknowledged the wisdom of it. He didn't trust the job to anyone else, and he was determined to protect Emma from any potential threat, including him. Chapter 2. Cold of a New York February night, Emma must have clicked over from tired to overtired because she was suddenly wide awake. Or maybe it was the extremely masculine presence beside her that had recharged her batteries. She'd always realized Aidan was hot. No woman could help noticing those shoulders, which filled out his custom-made suit without the benefit of. Had a nice butt, but she'd be willing to bet he did. He had the kind of jaw that usually showed up in shaving commercials, a strong nose and a high forehead. She suspected he was easily as intelligent as he. Added up to one yummy guy. But he'd given no indication he was interested in her personally. She was probably the only one who'd been affected by their brief contact when he'd about sharing the back seat of his town car with her, either. Because she didn't recognize any particular brand. She had the inappropriate. She wouldn't, of course, because she was with Doug even though he was meeting so he could be here tonight. It was her first signing since they'd deadline looming. She wasn't sure how great a girlfriend she was, period. Considering how much quality time she spent writing and how little quality. Maybe he was justified in missing the signing. But she hadn't had a chance to tell him about the creepy email from the guy. She kind of liked that Aidan Wallace who had to be worth a gazillion. She was opposed to a mega-expensive car dedicated to ferrying one person all the subway as always. Tonight Jenny had practically forced her to ride like car smoothly into traffic. What address in the village, Aidan? Wait. Aidan laid a hand on her arm. I just realized something. Her wool coat and silk dress was wildly exciting. Awareness sizzled in all of instant reaction to a man in ages. In fact, she told herself that she'd. He glanced at her, his eyes in shadow. You might not want me to know where. She almost laughed. If it weren't for Doug, she'd show him exactly where she. I could call a limo service instead of taking you home personally, he said. He looked mysterious, sexy, and damn near irresistible. Oh baby. I don't care if you know where I live. She hesitated as she debated the wisdom of saying what was on her mind. She'd have loved to go off. She'd thought of suggesting drinks to Jenny, but Jenny had a sick kid at home. That left her in the company of Aidan Wallace, a certified hunk who had have been so willing to offer her a ride home. Just what? He prompted. Her in any way, so this was business sort of, wasn't it? No, it wasn't. She was momentarily crushing on a gorgeous man who loved her books. Even if Aidan wasn't attracted to her, her interest in him was no. She sighed. Never mind. No, it's not the email. She didn't want to turn this into a silly game of attraction to him. Finishing a manuscript always makes me feel like my conscience. But her conscience was no match for the magnetic pull of. Aidan leaned toward the front seat. Drop us off at Jessie's, Ralph. Ralph hesitated for a fraction of a second. Sure thing. Emma wondered briefly about that hesitation, but the decision had been made. Behaved like one of her heroes. Of course, to really qualify he'd have to be a shifter who could become a wolf whenever he wanted to. And she wasn't doing that. She'd never heard of a night spot named Jessie's, but that meant nothing. Me. Alrighty then. Her guilt could take a long jump off a short pier. She wasn't simply having a social drink with a very attractive man who could serve. Should drinking booze in smoky bars and hanging out with all the clever people. Maybe having a glass of wine with a member of an influential New York. Ralph. I'll call when we're ready to leave. Take your time. It's a beautiful night. Ralph's manner was relaxed and easy. Estimation of Aidan, already hovering at good, moved into the excellent range. Held out his hand to Emma. Anticipation thrummed in her veins as she placed. She'd do well to remember that. He was humoring her desire to party a little. Black enameled doorway. When he used a card key to open the door, he verified her suspicion that he was taking her to a private club. No wonder she'd never heard of it. The black enameled door opened into a small lobby, decorated in grays and, think you'll like it. She had no doubt she would. So far, Aidan's world had seduced her with luxury. And she expected the same from this exclusive club. Soft jazz filtered down to footfalls amazingly light considering his solid build. She'd never realized until tonight how graceful he was. She felt like a klutz. A marvelous dancer. And a marvelous lover. The thought had no business. At the top of the stairs, a silver-haired man in a tuxedo moved out from. You. It's good to be back, Sylvester. This is Emma Gavin. She writes. Indeed a pleasure. I've read them all. Really? Fortunately, I was blessed with a good imagination. Too. Please. Aidan helped her off with her coat. She would have to get over that. while Sylvester hung their coats on a rack. Behind the desk she gave herself a talking to. Somehow wandered into an alternate universe? The club seemed to be nestled in Manhattan. I love it. She wasn't sure how the owners had managed the effect, but the trees arching over the small dance floor seemed real, as did the ones scattered around the perimeter of the room. Tiny white lights winked like fireflies in branches, which curved to create. Sylvester led them to a table near the back of the room and pulled out Emma's. Thank you, Sylvester. She glanced back at him. This is quite a place. Laid an affectionate hand on Aidan's shoulder before leaving them. Anyway, he obviously inspired friendship and respect among his associates. Find a little tavern somewhere. But this is breathtakingly beautiful. There's more. Look up. The foliage. The effect was so real she would swear someone had slid the roof back, except they were in the heart of the city, where the lights blocked out. She continued to gaze upward as she tried to figure out how they'd created the. That's it? Nothing more exotic. Out of her rut, she should experiment with a different drink. Any suggestions? I know. He blinked. Don't all writers drink coffee? Not necessarily. Some guzzle gallons of tea and others survive on Coke. The clichés aren't always true, but she thought it was cute that he had such a definite idea of how a writer should behave. Because without them she was likely to stare at Aidan the whole time. We called in some film people to help with the staging. We? Oh wait, I should have guessed that right away. Private club, you're. Yeah, it does. He stopped speaking and glanced toward the arched entryway. Looks like you're about to meet my little brother, Rourke. College professors had looked like that. Rourke might be younger than Aidan. Resemblance in his square jaw and strong nose. No slackers in the Wallace. The werewolf books. Good things, I hope. She wasn't sure what to make of Rourke's stern. Something was wrong. Maybe some security issue had come up, something only Aidan could handle. And yet, Rourke had sent her a wary glance before leaving. With Aidan, crazy as it sounded, she had the feeling that she was part of the. At the challenge in Rourke's voice, the hairs on the back of Aidan's neck rose. And he fought back a snarl. Reacting like a wolf wouldn't help matters any. You were assigned to watch her, not bring her into our private club. Counted at least 6 words in that room. He turned to Sylvester, who leaned casually against the reception desk, arms crossed. Sylvester makes 7. That. Aidan worked to control his temper. If Dad would wait for my report instead of sending you over to chew my ass, he'd discover that Emma is no danger to. Rourke's green eyes glittered. I suppose she told you that. Rourke blew out a breath in disbelief. Come on, Aidan. She can't be making. Just because you and I aren't that creative doesn't mean she isn't. But the problem goes beyond that. It's possible a rogue has contacted her by email. No. We've kept a close eye on all her internet activity. This is something. Aidan could have said, we'll make sure she never meets him, but he was no charge, which was the only way he could guarantee she'd be all right and the pack's anonymity would be protected. Rourke's belligerence faded. Have you seen the email? Not yet, but I will. In fact, now that you've brought that up, let me take care of something. Pulling out his phone, he sent a brief message so his tech crew could start the reverse trace. As he put the phone away, he glanced at Rourke. Tell Dad I'm here tonight. Because I'm trying to win her confidence. And depending on what I find out, Dad might need to get me assigned as her bodyguard for the book tour. Aidan. Aidan's jaw tightened. Why? You're not the one to do this. Of course I am. I'm the most highly trained security specialist we have. And you want her. As finely tuned as his, and they were brothers only 19 months apart. The minute Rourke had walked into the club, he'd known. What, you're Johnson? That brought a snort from Sylvester. Usually Aidan rolled with his brother's cracks, but tonight he wasn't amused. The situation, Rourke. I'll control the situation. Any context, but it's especially dangerous with this author chick. Aidan's lips curled back from his teeth. Don't talk about her like that. Rourke groaned. Damn, you've gone alpha. Next you'll be marking her front. Bite me. I'm tempted. Look, Aidan, don't go on this book tour. Watched send somebody else. I don't trust anyone else to handle it. Rourke threw up his hands. I see my little intervention came way too late. Dad should never have assigned you to this gig. I'll bet he hasn't ever cracked one of her books, has he? I doubt it, but what's that got to do with anything? She writes good sex. That's not Sure it is, Aidan. I picked up a copy of Night Shift today and flipped through it. The woman knows her stuff. On top of that, the Studley hero is, wait for it, a werewolf. You're Emma's dream guy. Who wouldn't get sucked in by that ego trip? I think Rourke has a point. I've read all her books, and if I were 20 years younger. Aidan knew then that he was in big trouble. Sylvester was a beloved uncle. Yet, Aidan had the urge to go for his throat simply because the older man had. Aidan raked a hand through his hair. You're both right. I need to take myself. And I will after we trace the email. Then my work here is done. Clapping Aidan on the shoulder, Rourke headed for the stairs. I knew you'd come to your senses, bro, he said over his shoulder. Aidan wasn't so sure about that. His genius IQ made him very good at his job. But it didn't seem to be helping him overcome his gut reaction to Emma. And, because he couldn't seem to overcome it, he'd have to assign someone else. Chapter 3. Their drinks had arrived, and at first Emma wondered whether she should wait until Aidan returned to take a sip, but the frothy martini, decorated with 3 coffee beans, called to her. Depending on the problem Aidan had with Rourke, she might not get to stay, and she wanted to know what this new drink tasted like. Not surprisingly, it tasted like heaven. She was definitely Googling the recipe when she got back to her loft. Or maybe Aidan, who owned the joint, could get her the exact recipe because she didn't want a variation of a coffee martini. She wanted this one. She took a longer sip. Chances were slim she'd get to come here again. She told Doug about it, and she would tell Doug. She vowed for about the third time she could predict the result. Because he was a man with manly instincts. Although they were sometimes obscured by a preoccupation with the tax code, Doug would show up at her next signing so he could meet Aidan Wallace. That could be interesting. The two men were about the same height, but that was where the resemblance ended. Aidan had the body of a star quarterback. Doug had the body of a star bridge player. She admired Doug for his mind, which was a perfect left brain complement to her overly active right brain. But she'd never kidded herself that his body was a wonder to behold. It was, not fat or skinny, just sort of there. Functional. Until tonight, she'd considered herself more evolved these days because she no longer required sculpted muscles in order to date a man. She took another sip of her drink as Aidan walked back toward their table. Apparently she was regressing to her teen years because watching Aidan move gave her goose bumps. Sorry about that. Aidan returned to his seat. Family stuff. He seemed quiet. Do we need to leave? I mean, if there's something you should take care of, I certainly understand.
No.
Rourke just had some things to tell me. Yet he definitely seemed subdued by the conversation. She was curious, but she couldn't start quizzing him. She didn't know him well. And didn't know his family at all. I'm afraid I started without you. The coffee martini's great. His smile returned. Glad you like it. He took a drink of his and nodded. Frederick does a good job at the bar. Does Frederick ever give out his recipes? Aidan shook his head.
No recipes.
The guy mixes drinks instinctively now, and he probably couldn't tell you how to make this even if he wanted to. Then it's Google time for me, but guaranteed it won't be the same. Sorry. The silence that followed that single word response told her all she needed to know. That would have been his cue to mention bringing her back again sometime, and he hadn't said a word. She knew about Doug, but Aidan didn't, so something else was stopping him from pursuing the relationship. Imagining what that might be was too depressing, so she wouldn't think about. The music's nice too. He studied her for a moment. Would you like to dance? The question startled her, especially after she'd concluded that he had no interest in her whatsoever, other than her writing ability. I wasn't dropping hints. You invited me for a drink, and that's what we're having. Please don't feel obligated to dance with me because I mentioned the music. I didn't ask because I feel obligated. She checked his expression for sincerity. His light brown eyes were warm, and that cute little half-smile had reappeared. Talk about your mixed signals. Now he did seem interested. She had a horrible thought. What if he was the kind of man who was into conquest? She knew absolutely nothing about his personal life or his track record with women. He certainly had the physique and charisma to be a Don Juan. What if he planned to seduce her tonight and then mark her off a master list he kept in his head? Best-selling author check. Well, she had a built-in braking system for that kind of man. I'm seeing someone. I figured you must be. His eyes glowed with good humor. Now she felt gauche and unsophisticated. People danced all the time without heading straight for a bedroom afterward. He did have beautiful eyes. Not that I think you meant anything by asking me to dance. I just thought you should know. So you don't want to dance? That was the problem. She'd love to dance with this man who might or might not be trying to take advantage of her. If he had sex in mind, she wouldn't let things go that far. And it was only a dance. And yet telling Doug that she'd had a drink with a fan after the signing was one thing. She wouldn't even have to mention that the fan was male, actually. But if she admitted that she'd also danced with said fan, the man-fan thing would become known and the incident would begin to look suspicious. But the evening would never be repeated either. She knew that because he hadn't offered to bring her back sometime for another coffee martini. So this would be her one and only opportunity to have a close encounter of the rhythmic kind with Aidan Wallace. Chickening out might make her feel less guilty about Doug, but she'd regret missing the experience of dancing with this hot guy. Research. She'd nearly forgotten that she'd decided to make tonight all about research. What if the heroine in her next book decided to go dancing with the hunky hero? Sure, Emma could put her imagination to work as to how that would feel, but first-hand knowledge would definitely help. I'd love to dance, she said. Good. Standing, he took off his jacket and hung it over the back of his chair. He was even more magnificent without the jacket, which had somewhat disguised his pecs. The gray silk dress shirt, open at the collar, fit him like a dream. She gulped a little more of her martini for courage before standing and walking ahead of him to the dance floor. Once there, she turned, prepared to be swept into his strong arms. Or not. The band switched numbers, launching into a tune with a fast driving beat. Emma glanced at Aidan, who shrugged and smiled. Then he stepped onto the floor and initiated the sexiest hip action she'd seen outside of Dancing with the Stars. Adrenaline pumped through her system as she followed suit with a grin of delight. She had a few moves of her own, and recently they'd been confined to the privacy of her apartment. Back in the day, she'd enjoyed the club scene, but her intense career didn't give her the time to party. Besides, she didn't have the right partner. Doug was willing to dance, but his sense of timing left something to be desired. Aidan had the rhythm of a born athlete. If he made love the way he danced, oh, better not go there, girl. She quickly pulled herself back from the edge of that perilous cliff of supposition. Instead of picturing Aidan naked in tangled sheets, which she would not do, she channeled her sexual energy into her dancing. It was a decent plan, but ultimately a flawed one. She couldn't dance without watching Aidan, or she was liable to bump into him. She already felt less coordinated than he was, and turning the dance floor into a mosh pit wouldn't be cool. Therefore she became aware of each swivel of his hips, each thrust of his pelvis. She found herself mirroring him in the same way she might if they were horizontal on an inner spring. They weren't touching, and yet she felt his heat burning all the way to the forbidden zone, the place she was supposed to keep safe and warm for Doug. Nothing was safe from a man like Aidan. She'd naively thought she could control the situation tonight. Fat chance. If this kept up, somebody would have to turn a fire hose on them. But the music stopped, leaving them breathing fast and laughing as they gazed at each other. Before Emma could gather her wits, the band eased into a slow number. Aidan closed the distance between them and drew her into his arms. The top of her head would have fit under his chin if she'd allowed herself to snuggle in. She resisted the impulse and gazed up at him. Nice dancing. Same to you. He guided her in a lazy waltz, his thighs brushing hers. His touch was steady and gentle as he telegraphed his movements with subtle pressure against the small of her back. As with any talented dancer, he made his partner, aka Emma, look and feel good. She'd never danced with such effortless pleasure in her life. He was weaving a spell that was a mixture of blatant sexuality and romantic tenderness. Women probably fell all over themselves to become a notch in this man's belt, assuming he was a notches in the belt kind of guy. Conversation might help keep her out of trouble, though. No fair, she said. You've had lessons. Not formal lessons. He brought her a fraction closer, causing her breasts to settle against his firm chest. I learned at family gatherings. You dance at family parties? The idea of a family dancing together enchanted her almost as much as the thought of the party itself. She didn't have parties with relatives. Her family consisted of her and her mom. An aunt lived out in California, and Emma had some cousins there whom she barely knew. Her dad had left when she was a baby and had never been heard from again. It's a family tradition to have music at our events, so of course everybody is expected to learn to dance. That's nice. The closer he held her, the less she felt inclined to make conversation. He felt so damn good. Worse yet, he smelled good too. She still couldn't identify his cologne, but she desperately wanted to nestle her cheek against his chest and breathe in that heady male fragrance. She longed to be seduced, but she'd hate herself in the morning, so she resisted the snuggle urge. The alternative wasn't much better. She was left looking up into his caramel-colored eyes like a lovesick teenager, which was pretty much how she felt. Aidan was rich, handsome, and a terrific dancer. What woman wouldn't want all that in her bed? Do you have a girlfriend? The second the words were out, she wanted them back. No doubt her face was turning red. Lovely. Cancel that. Forget I asked. It's none of my business. No, I don't have a girlfriend. By now they were plastered together from chest to groin. She could feel the steady thump of his heart and, yes, his obvious arousal. Easing away from him would be the smart way to handle this. She'd always been a smart girl, but she'd never come up against, literally, the likes of Aidan Wallace. Now that she was in his arms, she never wanted to leave. When the music ended, he studied her without loosening his hold. I suppose you should be getting home. Wanna come with me? I suppose. Something flickered in his eyes, as if he were wrestling with a problem. Then the sparkle disappeared, and his grip loosened. I should probably be getting home too. I'll call Ralph. So that was that. When he released her, the cool air of reason caressed her heated skin. Whether he was a playboy or not, he'd obviously decided against playing with her. Time to end this encounter, whatever it was. Time for Cinderella to climb into her pumpkin coach and leave the ball. Dancing with her had been a bad idea, but Aidan had figured he was about to be pulled off the case and he'd wanted to see her dance in person just once. Fortunately, she'd missed seeing him signal the band to play a fast number. She probably thought that was an accident. No, he'd engineered the whole sequence, and now he had only himself to blame for his present sexual frustration, which could lead to some embarrassing and potentially dangerous consequences. As he rode back to her apartment with her in the cozy rear seat of the town car, the backs of his hands prickled and his tailbone itched. He'd inherited a rare genetic condition that showed up only every second or third generation. If he happened to be in human form when he was aroused with no prospect of satisfaction, his body strained to shift instead as a kind of compensation. An orgasm could calm him immediately and stop the process, but that wouldn't be happening anytime soon. He should have sent Emma home in the town car by herself. He could have called Rourke to come and get him. Then again, maybe not. If Rourke had been driving his Ferrari and using the fuzzbuster, he'd probably made it back to the family estate and was enjoying a recreational run through the woods by now. Okay, so Rourke might not have been available, but there had been other options for Aidan, like commercial limos. Still, he'd felt the need to see Emma safely home to her apartment. Once they were closed inside the back seat together, though, and his teeth ached with the need to sharpen and grow, he realized he was screwed, and not in a good way. Worse yet, his chauffeur must have sensed that the air was thick with unmet sexual needs. Any werewolf would be able to pick up on that. That explained why Ralph kept his eyes on the road ahead and hadn't attempted conversation. He might have thought coupling was about to happen in the back of the town car. Aidan needed a distraction, and he needed it now. He glanced at Emma. Do you have your phone with you? My phone? She seemed startled. Yes, I do, but I turned it off before the signing and never turned it back on. Why? Can you access your email on it? He knew damned well she could, but he wasn't supposed to know, so he had to play the game and ask. Yes, but oh, I get it. She unzipped her purse and pulled out her BlackBerry. You want to see the email from the creepy guy? Just to get an idea of how hard it'll be to trace. And to keep me from grabbing you and kissing you until you let me do whatever I want right here in the back seat of the town car. That was the other part of the equation. Judging from the way she danced with him, the slightest bit of effort on his part would make her forget all about Dougie Boy. knowing she wanted him while he could do nothing about it, made the pressure to shift even worse. The beginnings of a pelt rubbed against his silk shirt. Sure. Just a sec. She turned on the phone and waited for an internet connection. Seconds later she handed him the phone. Here it is. He gazed at the small screen and forced himself to concentrate on the words there instead of allowing her scent to pull him into a sensual whirlpool from which there would be no escape. Once they started down that road they wouldn't stop until they'd wrung each other out. The dancing had told him that if he'd wanted her a little less, he might chance making love to her tonight. That had been his criterion from his first sexual encounter, at the age of 16. He'd indulge only if he knew they could both walk away at the end of the affair. He'd been able to tell his were lovers he would have to make a political match someday and therefore couldn't get serious. They'd always understood that. For his human lovers, and he'd had a few, he'd chosen women who were too focused on their careers to think about settling down with one guy. They'd been attractive and sexy, but not a single one had affected him the way Emma did. And he hadn't even taken her to bed yet. Yet, the word flashed like a neon sign in his brain. Had he actually thought such a ridiculous thing? The word yet implied that he saw taking her to bed as inevitable. He didn't. Damn it, he didn't. He could beat this attraction no matter how strong it seemed now. Just because he wanted to rip that red dress from her body and explore every inch of her soft skin didn't mean that he would. Just because he longed to stroke her pert breasts until... Can you see it okay? She asked. I can make the text bigger if you need me to. Thanks, but I can see it just fine. I'm thinking. His eyesight was far better than she would ever know. And he hadn't lied. He had been thinking. Just not about the email in front of him. As a result, his pelt had grown even thicker. When he transformed, his fur was deep brown tipped with silver. And he was afraid that some silver fur might be sticking out of the open neck of his dress shirt already. Once again he focused on the email, and this time he was able to actually read the damn thing. Hey babe, I can tell from the way you write about werewolves that you dig them. Girl, you need to get it on with a real werewolf and I'm the one to show you the ropes. Right back and I'll meet you whenever and wherever you say. Until then, think of me as always ready for you. Aidan growled. Aidan? Are you okay? Shit. He'd growled and she'd heard him. He made a big production of clearing his throat before he turned to answer her. I felt like I had something stuck in my throat. It's gone now. She laughed. You clearing your throat sounds a lot like a Doberman guarding the front door. She couldn't know how close she'd come to describing exactly how he felt. Some asshole was trying to make contact with her for the purpose of sex.
Aidan no
longer cared whether the guy was a werewolf or only pretending to be so he could meet her. Aidan would track him to his lair wherever that might be, and put him out of commission. Emma's laughter faded. You're looking really fierce right now. In fact, you're scaring me a little. Immediately he offered her his most winning smile and hoped to hell his canines didn't look too frightening yet. Sorry. It's just that I hate guys who use the internet to harass women. Do you think you can find out where he is? Absolutely. And I don't want to wait until tomorrow to start the process. Ralph pulled up in front of her building. Aidan reached inside his suit jacket and took out another card. If you'll send the email to that address, I'll get on it tonight. Unwittingly, he'd created a great cover for the fact that his guys were already working on the trace. Now that we're at my place, why not come up to my loft and use my computer? I'll make coffee. God, did she have any idea what she was saying? He thought maybe she did. Lust shone in her blue eyes. She knew exactly what she was saying, and Doug had mentally been kicked to the curb. He clenched his back teeth together to keep himself from saying yes. Yes to the invitation, yes to the coffee, and yes to the sex that would definitely take place if he stepped foot inside her apartment. He might be able to accomplish the deed without her noticing that he'd become unusually hairy. But he wouldn't do it. Rourke was going to be so proud of him. Thanks, but you need sleep, and I can work better on my own equipment. Saying that nearly killed him, but he felt noble as hell. But seriously, it's important to accomplish this, and it'll all go faster at my place, which would be his office instead of his apartment, but she didn't have to know that. I'll email you the results when I'm done so you'll have the information in the morning and can pass it on to Jenny. Okay. The word was drenched in frustration and disappointment. Hell, she seriously wanted him to spend the night with her. And he wasn't going to. Rourke should give him a damned medal. We'll wait here while you let yourself in and go upstairs, he said. Leave your phone on, and if there's any problem when you get up there, call me. He pulled his phone out of his jacket and turned it on. I can be there in no time. She gazed at him. Sure you won't come up? His tail was growing and beginning to bush out. I'm sure. Then I probably won't see you again until the next book comes out. Guess not. He doubted he'd be at her next signing. He could get a book autographed through Roger Claymore. That would be a safer option. Thanks for a terrific evening. Before he could stop her, she leaned forward and kissed him full on the mouth. Then she scrambled quickly out of the car, out of his reach, and closed the door. His mouth felt branded by hers, and he wanted more, much more. Ralph chuckled. Guess you have something stuck in your throat again. Listen, Ralph, old buddy. You'd growl too if you... Yeah, I know, Aidan. You get major points for not going up there. Aidan kept his eye on her window until he saw the light go on. Then his phone rang and he immediately answered. What? Just wanted you to know that everything's fine. Good night, Aidan. Good night, Emma. He disconnected the phone and closed his eyes. Drop me off in the park, Ralph, and step on it. Ralph quickly navigated into traffic. The park's risky. Let me take you north. To the estate.
No.
Can't afford the time. Aidan gritted his teeth and fought the shift that was coming whether he wanted it to or not. I want to make sure the guys are working on that email trace. You're the boss. Ralph wove in and out of traffic. As they neared the park, Aidan began pulling off his clothes. If I run for well, I should be able to shift back in an hour or so. Wait for me. Will do. Ralph drove into Central Park and cruised along slowly. How's this? Good. Not much light. Give me 3 minutes to finish shifting and then come around and open the door for me. All right. Ralph didn't sound happy about it, but he would do what Aidan asked. In exactly 3 minutes, the back door of the town car opened. Aidan leaped out and began to run, his paws scattering the remnants of snow left on the ground. He would run until he was exhausted. Maybe then he wouldn't want Emma, with the fierceness only an alpha male could feel toward a woman who'd awakened his instinct to mate. Chapter 4. Doug called at 8, waking Emma from a hot dream that involved Aidan and a grassy knoll. Aidan was licking up drops of the coffee martini he'd poured all over her naked body, and she was delirious. She would have loved to find out what happened after that, and now she'd never know. She must have sounded as annoyed as she felt, because Doug immediately became contrite. Bad turnout last night, huh?
No.
Why would you think that? His tone changed. Because you're in a crappy mood. You woke me up, Doug. I haven't had coffee yet. Woke you up? It's past 8. Barely. Emma rolled her eyes. Doug kept regular hours and had never quite adjusted to the fact she didn't. I slept in. Did you and your mom stay out late last night then? No, Mom had to leave right after the signing, so I went for a drink with one of my fans. There, she'd said it. She hadn't exactly told the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, but she'd thrown out a piece of information that was correct as far as it went. I'll bet you made her evening too. See, if I'd gone, you wouldn't have felt free to do that, and I'm sure you girls had a great time sipping umbrella drinks and talking about sexy werewolves. If Doug had called at 9, after Emma had brewed herself some coffee and consumed a cup or two, she might not have reacted so adversely to that patronizing remark. But he'd called at 8 when she was involved in a most excellent dream of passion and sexual adventure with the man who made her current boyfriend look like a dweeb. She was at least a quart low on caffeine. And come to think of it, her boyfriend was a dweeb. You know what, Doug? I just decided we should take a break from each other. What? A break? A hiatus? A sabbatical? It's perfect timing because you're heading into tax season and I'm leaving on a book tour Friday morning. Emma, don't do this. I know you wanted me to show up last night, but the meeting was important. A couple of members are thinking of giving me their corporate business, and that would be huge. This isn't about last night. And it really wasn't. It was about this morning. Well, it might be about last night, but not in the way he thought. She might not be able to have Aidan Wallace, but she could start looking around for someone who was more exciting than Doug. Because of her heavy writing schedule, she'd allowed herself to settle for someone who was near at hand, even if he did virtually nothing for her sexually. That wasn't fair to her, and it wasn't fair to Doug. Emma, let's have lunch today. We'll talk it out. I promise to come to the next book signing you have here in town. I'm not free for lunch, and I mean it, Doug. I don't think either of us is invested in this relationship the way we should be. Let's take a step back. After tax season is over, if we decide to continue seeing each other, we can talk about what we each want in a partner. Unfortunately for Doug, she now wanted muscles on her man. You don't want to see me until after April 15th? That's impossible. Why? We have to review your tax picture. She almost laughed but caught herself before she did. Laughing would be mean. The fact remained that he was more worried about her 1040 than their future as a couple. Doug, you've been doing my taxes for 5 years. I don't think we need to review them in person. It's better if we do. You could be right. Privately, she thought Doug liked using the sessions to parade his knowledge and pass out what he considered gold-plated advice. He got to be the authority and the big cheese during those meetings. She'd never enjoyed them much. Then let's set up a time. Let's not. She hoped he wouldn't screw up her taxes on purpose, but she didn't think he would stoop that low. We can communicate by email. Have a great tax season. I truly wish you the best. Wait. You can't just do this. It's for the best. Goodbye, Doug. Then she disconnected the call. When he immediately called back, she didn't answer. She did, however, listen to the message he left. Emma, is it that time of the month? Yep, he was a dweeb. Aidan and his team had spent several hours on the email trace, and then he had managed to grab some sleep at home. Now he was headed back to the Wallace building in Lower Manhattan to report his findings to his father. Ralph picked him up as usual. Technically, Aidan should have been exhausted, but the challenge of this case and his concern for Emma kept his adrenaline pumping. A good run always helped too. His recreational romp through Central Park had been without incident. Few people with any sense wandered around in there late at night anyway. Anyone at the park at that hour likely wouldn't be the kind of person who ran to the police for any reason, let alone because he or she'd seen a large brown and silver wolf loping through the trees. Still, it had been a risk. Anything that called attention to the pack constituted a risk. Yet he'd been forced to do something that would allow him to work off his sexual tension so he could shift back into human form. Once he'd felt that beginning to happen, he'd bounded back to the town car so that he could use the privacy of the back seat to shift and then dress in the clothes he'd left there. The sun was shining brightly the next morning when Ralph pulled up in front of the 50-story building that housed Wallace Enterprises on the top 2 floors. Want me to wait for you? That's okay. I'm thinking you could use some time off. If I need a ride anywhere, I'll get one of Dad's drivers. Ralph smiled. Thanks. I'll take you up on that. Maybe Fran and I will have lunch uptown and go to a matinee. Good idea. Have fun. I'll be in touch tomorrow. As Aidan entered the tall building and headed for the elevator bank, he realized he envied his driver, who'd been married to Fran for almost 30 years. They still loved each other, still enjoyed simple things like lunch and a movie. Aside from the fact they were both werewolves, they lived a fairly typical middle-class life. Most of the time, Aidan was happy about his privileged position in the Wallace Empire. But a less privileged position would mean he'd be free to mate for love and not political expedience. He might look forward to a marriage like Ralph and Fran's. He still wouldn't be able to choose a human like Emma, though. Sex with humans was common, but marriages were almost unheard of. A wer would never be able to keep his or her wolf status a secret from a spouse, so the spouse had to be trusted with the sensitive knowledge that a werewolf community existed. Understandably, that made the rest of the pack extremely nervous. Because of Aidan's strong attraction to Emma, one that was mate-worthy, he'd have to steer clear of her, and he would, right after he fixed the current problem. Stepping out of the elevator, he walked across thick green and brown patterned carpet. Wers preferred something that reminded them of grass and the spongy texture of the forest floor. Plants abounded here in the lobby. Aidan glanced at the giant flat screen running videos similar to his that featured trees and waterfalls. Visitors thought the Wallaces were eco-conscious, and they certainly were that. But the decor was a matter of personal sanity more than a statement about conservation. Being surrounded by images of nature soothed his father and any other members of the pack who felt overwhelmed by the noise of the city. From the lobby, Aidan moved through the open double doors leading to the receptionist's office. Gabrielle, a 35-year-old who'd moved to New York from the San Francisco pack, looked up from her computer as he arrived. A redhead in human form, she transformed into a russet she-wolf. She was stunning either way and had caught the eye of several members of the Wallace pack. But she'd recently ended a relationship in San Francisco and wasn't interested. "He's expecting you, Aidan. Go on in." "Thanks." In a detached sort of way, he noticed that he wasn't interested in flirting with her either. When she'd taken the job, he'd thought they might enjoy a no-strings-attached affair, but she hadn't been ready for that. He'd continue to be friendly in hopes that she'd change her mind. But after an evening with Emma, he realized he didn't care whether Gabrielle changed her mind. At some point, he'd have to rid himself of what was becoming an obsession with the lovely Miss Gavin, but he couldn't expect to do it until he'd finished the business at hand. Opening the hand-carved door into his father's office, he allowed his eyes to adjust to the dim light. Howard Wallace didn't appreciate the floor-to-ceiling windows that graced nearly every Manhattan office of any size and importance, including this one. He didn't give a damn about the skyline, but he liked being up here away from the traffic noise. The office was scented with evergreens and peat moss because they were here in abundance, in various planters around the room. Foliage covered the windows so that only a few rays of sunlight penetrated through the dense array of greenery. Aidan loved the feel of his dad's office and had used many of the design elements in his own apartment. His own office was on the floor below this one, but his team used it more than he did. His job kept him on the move, which he happened to like. Howard rose from his massive yet rustic-looking desk and came around it to embrace his son. A barrel-chested man in his late 50s, Howard still had all his hair, although it was snow-white. The pack alpha was a sight to behold. When he transformed into a magnificent creature with snow-white fur, his striking appearance was legendary in the work community. Howard stood back to look at his son with obvious fondness. "What do you have for me, Aidan?" Aidan knew that benevolence could change to stern censure under certain conditions. He hoped that wouldn't happen today. "A delicate situation, I'm afraid." "Let's sit." Howard gestured toward a group of black leather chairs circling a low table in the corner of his office. "Do you want something to drink? Anything to eat?" Aidan tried to remember when he'd done either. The few sips of a coffee martini might be the extent of it since an early dinner the night before. But he knew that his father's two-floor suite of offices included a kitchen and a world-class chef. And at the mention of food, Aidan discovered he was starving. A roast beef sandwich would hit the spot. Say no more. Howard crossed to his desk and picked up the phone. A moment later he returned to the circle of chairs and took a seat next to Aidan. "Gabrielle will see to it." "Thanks, Dad." Now that Aidan had admitted to his hunger, he felt the contractions of his very empty stomach. Howard shook his head. "I notice you're still in the habit of working straight through without eating. I admire the single-mindedness, but it's not good for your health. Your mother would raise a bigger ruckus than I, so be glad it's me who's telling you this." "I'll try to do better." "Good. If you pass out in the middle of an assignment, you won't be doing anyone any favors." Howard settled back in his chair. "Now tell me about Emma." "Gavin." For one unsettling moment, Aidan thought his father had guessed Aidan's secret yearning for the talented Miss Gavin. He took a deep breath and told himself, that was crazy. Rourke wouldn't have said anything and nobody else knew. Besides Sylvester. Sylvester wasn't a snitch either. "Our initial suspicions were wrong," Aidan said. "She not only has no inside source, she doesn't believe that werewolves exist." Howard's gray eyes narrowed. "Are you absolutely sure of this?" "Yes." He'd thought about it some more. If Emma had any idea that werewolves were real, she would have sensed the changes happening to him last night in the back seat of the town car. When humans believed that werewolves were a reality, it was as if they'd broken a secret code. If she'd known that code, she could have identified him easily. "So we don't have a problem after all." "Not quite true." Gabrielle knocked on the office door, and Howard invited her in. She brought a tray containing a fragrant sandwich and a bottle of Aidan's favorite mineral water. He was touched that she'd noticed such a small thing. As she set the tray on the circular coffee table, she leaned down far enough to provide a glimpse of cleavage while glancing at Aidan from under her lashes. Damn, now she was ready to flirt with him when his hormonal urges were all focused on a certain author of werewolf fiction. Thanks so much, Gabrielle. He smiled at her. Anytime. Her voice held that low, throaty quality that telegraphed sexual interest. Anything else, Mr. Wallace? Howard looked at Aidan. Anything missing, son? Nope. Aidan unfolded the cloth napkin and laid it over his lap. This is great. Then I guess we're good, Gabrielle. Hold my calls until Aidan leaves, okay? Of course. With one last sultry glance in Aidan's direction, she left the. Howard blew out a breath. I think she's coming out of hibernation. Just for the record, I don't care what happens between you two so long as it doesn't disrupt her work. And it goes without saying that she's not an acceptable mate for you, so it would have to be a temporary thing. I know that. Still, I can't expect you to be celibate, for God's sake, so go ahead, but don't mess up my office routine, please. Gabrielle's been reliable so far and I'd hate for that to change. Dad, I'm not interested in Gabrielle. Aidan picked up half of the sandwich. Right now I have work to do. My team pulled an all-nighter and we found out a lot. Someone from the Chicago pack has contacted Emma and wants to show her what a real werewolf is like. Howard nearly came out of his chair. The hell you say? Leland's bunch? I'll call him right now. I wouldn't do that, Dad. It's Leland's son, Theo. Oh dear God. Howard scrubbed a hand over his face. That changes everything. I figured it would. Theo Henderson has delivered trouble to Leland's doorstep for all his 19 years. Everyone sees it but Leland. He insists Theo's high-strung and he'll grow out of it. Leland never did believe that Theo was the one who broke into the zoo, drugged a couple of wolves, and dressed them in Armani. I didn't hear about that. Aidan put down his sandwich, no longer hungry. Once every 100 years or so a were came along who chafed against the rule of concealment. These militant wers advocated full disclosure followed by complete domination of all humans. Do you think Theo has visions of a werewolf revolution of some kind? I hope for all our sakes he's just a mixed-up kid. How Leland could have raised two such different wers is beyond me. Nadia's a credit to the community, but Theo seems determined to make problems. Has he done anything else I should know about? At Halloween he always insisted on dressing as a werewolf, and he's mouthed off a few times about how he resents not being able to shift whenever he feels like it. He's risked getting caught more than once. Aidan couldn't fault Theo on that score, after his own inappropriate shift last night. But if Theo was doing it intentionally, that put him in a different category. This isn't sounding good. No, but Leland wouldn't believe Theo's headed down revolutionary road, and I don't want to be the one to suggest it to him, considering that I have high hopes that Nadia will become your mate someday. You'd make a stunning pair. Aidan ignored the weight of responsibility that settled over him with that statement. He recognized that Nadia was attractive. In her human form she was tall with long dark hair that reached halfway down her back. In wolf form she was glossy black with gray eyes. At the moment the only eyes he cared to gaze into were blue. So I'm hoping you have some ideas for dealing with this Henderson pup, Howard said. Ideas that don't involve confronting Leland. I see that as a last resort. Aidan took a deep breath. All right. I need you to contact Roger Claymore and have me assigned to travel with Emma as far as Chicago. I'll do that. Good plan. If you give the okay, I'll let her publisher know that the possible stalker is from there. I'll monitor the Chicago gig and intercept Theo if he should show up. I'll gently remind him that he's putting the entire werewolf community at risk and send him back home. I think I'll be very convincing. Howard nodded. I'm sure you will be. He stood. Let me call Roger right now. When does Emma leave on tour? Friday morning. She'll spend Friday night, all day Saturday and Saturday night in Chicago. When she leaves there, I'll have neutralized the threat. I'll come home, and she can continue on to Denver for the rest of her tour. Excellent. I know you'll keep this on the down low, as they say these days. It goes without saying that the less Emma knows about the Henderson-Wallace connection, the better. Right. I feel good knowing you'll be handling this, son. Aidan squashed any feelings of uneasiness. He was the logical person for the Assignment because as the firstborn of the Alpha, he carried the authority of the entire Wallace pack. He would be the most effective in shutting down Theo. Henderson. Rourke might not approve of this trip, but Aidan could control himself. It was only 2 days and 2 nights. Chapter 5. Ginny, it's ludicrous and unnecessary. Wearing gray sweats and a black wool Blackberry to her ear. You're telling me he's only 19, which means this is probably just a kid with a crush. I don't need a high-powered security expert like Aidan Wallace to fix this. I've lost control of the situation, Ginny said. Howard Wallace has friendship. Wallace Enterprises is cutting Aidan's usual fee in half. And you, Ginny, Emma sighed in frustration. How am I supposed to explain him to the... Won't they freak out if they think I'm in enough danger to need a bodyguard? Which I'm not, but having Mr. Muscles there will make it. Mr. Muscles. Ginny laughed. That's good. Anyway, no worries about the itinerary, and he'll become your escort for the Chicago gig. It's only 2. Kissed him for Christ's sake. She'd based that impulse on her firm belief that she wouldn't see him until the next book signing, and by then she'd have a sexy boyfriend to call her own, somebody who would stack up very well. Please, Ginny said. Howard's put the fear of God into Roger, and he's along and monitor your Chicago appearances. Emma closed her eyes in resignation. Okay. So she'd have to be humiliated. Grown woman safe from a love-struck teenager. Damn, she'd made such a fool of herself last night, too. She'd practically begged him to come upstairs with her, and he'd turned her down. Twice. But had his body. How could she face him at JFK on Friday morning? She had only one. In the presence of his hot body would take some doing. Aidan arrived at the gate early on Friday morning. He hadn't seen Emma in the... He bought coffee and sipped it as he paced the gate area and cast frequent, and insisted on picking her up in the town car to guarantee she'd be on time. They'd exchanged a couple of brief emails in which he'd suggested exactly rejected her invitation on Wednesday night. She'd want to keep her distance, and that was all for the better, especially considering the plan he'd devised to make sure Theo backed off himself as her fiancé, but he had to make sure the masquerade didn't tempt him. Pulled out his BlackBerry and called her. No answer. Damn it, this was not a good way to start out. Her blonde hair bounced around her shoulders, and her black trench coat was unbuttoned. It flapped back to reveal a turquoise suit that hugged her curves. Jacket, and the shadow of her cleavage was visible through the delicate lace. They're calling for us to board, he said as she approached. In the 30. You switched me to first class. Her blue eyes flashed with indignation. I've been down at the ticket counter trying to change back to coach, but she smelled absolutely wonderful. Ginny didn't tell you she rebooked? Upgrade. What's wrong with first class? He would. Going first class was in his blood, and besides, booking at the last would have been squashed into a middle seat in the tail section. Not his idea of fun, and inefficient to boot. He needed to be right beside her when they... Although she'd mentioned Emma might not be happy about it. Of irritation. But unless she wanted to give up on the Chicago part of her. At this point. I suppose not. Most people would be grateful, wouldn't they? Sorry. At least we're taking public transportation. She stared at him. Don't tell me you considered taking the Wallace Corporate. That's a colossal understatement. She shook her head in obvious dismay. Well, I wouldn't quite put it that way. He swept a hand toward the gate. After you. Up ahead of them waiting to get on. That meant standing together in the jetway. Chicago on Sunday, you'll be in the seat Jenny reserved in the first place. She glanced at him. I didn't mean to be a brat about it, but I don't like. Apology accepted. And I confess that if I can't take the corporate jet, I'm all about first class. I don't fit into the coach seats very well. Can't expect you to make it crammed into coach, which would only add insult to. As the line began moving again, he and Emma moved with it. Told me he's 19. He read one of my books and now he's enjoying a. His senses sharpened. Did you mean to say emails as in more than one? Much of this, and now they've included you in the insanity. She walked toward the doorway of the plane. You didn't delete the emails, did you? Thank God for small favors. He followed her. Window or aisle? That worked nicely for him. Even in first class his legs felt cramped if he relinquished it, thanked the attendant and took her seat. She tucked her computer case under the seat in front of her and sat back. Leather. Then he groaned inwardly as his hormone-soaked brain focused on that sensuous. Himself he could do this without danger of sprouting fur, and yet the backs of. He handed off his topcoat and tucked his own computer case under the seat in. Attendant came by asking about coffee. He smiled at the attendant and shook his head before going back to the screen. And Theo's messages. Only a tiny bit. You're dieting? So this is how I balance it out. She fastened her seatbelt. From observing how the belt rode low and tight over her hips, exactly as the flight attendant would instruct them to fasten them during takeoff. Himself say against all good judgment, but you're perfect. Her eyes rounded. Excuse me. I meant that you're perfectly okay now. I don't get the dieting thing. The other night I thought you were interested in me, but then I decided you weren't. Now you seem interested again. I'm getting whiplash. Aidan grabbed the first lifeline he could think of. You said you had it. When he looked into those blue eyes of hers, he had a hard time lying.
No.
Not really. He could tell her some of the truth at least. The fact is I tend to have a. To your loft I'd lose focus. I admire that, Aidan. She looked past him toward the aisle. Thank God. Your first cup. He helped the flight attendant pass the steaming cup over to. I'm afraid I'll get used to it. Get spoiled. Point, I haven't made enough to keep me in first-class seats for the rest of. He stated what she had to be thinking. Whereas I was born with a silver spoon. Pretty much. Cooks, chauffeurs. His father was an investment genius and the family had. Don't get me wrong, she said. I've noticed that the people you employ are. Supports a whole raft of charities. I'm not dissing your situation, but it's. She had no idea how different. My dad abandoned my mom when I was a baby, and she managed to raise me and. Listen about Doug, my boyfriend, The plane's engines revved up, cutting off the rest of what she'd been about to say. Knowing he'd have to shut down her BlackBerry any second, Aidan quickly glanced over Theo's 2 emails. Here you're coming to Cheetown, sweet thing. Looking forward to making that special connection, if you know what I mean. I'm still ready for you. Aidan scrolled to the next one. Where's do it on all fours? Think about it. Ready for you. Aidan ground some enamel off his back molars. Sure, Theo was just a kid, but Aidan's intellectual evaluation. But the emails affected him at a deeper level. Emma was not his mate, would. Possessive instinct he had. Maybe that wasn't a bad thing for the short term. Cringe in fear if Aidan presented himself as Emma's mate. We're ready to. Aidan wasn't certain he could play that role and then abandon it again on Sunday. Doing so could end the problem with Theo, though. Sir, the flight attendant said, I'll have to ask you to turn off your. Right. He quickly put his cell number in a vacant speed dial position. Then went through the seatbelt and flotation device spiel. You now have me on. Speed dial letter Z. Oh. She looked annoyed. I guess that's okay. Don't worry. I will. He settled back in his seat and tried to imagine himself running through the forest. Flying made him uneasy, which was another reason for choosing first class. Wolves weren't meant to be suspended 30,000 feet in the air. Flying made his ears hurt and dried out his sinuses. When he flew alone, he drowned out the engine noise by wearing top-grade earphones tuned to a medley of forest sounds, but that wouldn't be happening today. As they taxied down the runway, he gripped the armrests and swallowed. Emma must have noticed, because she glanced at him with undisguised curiosity. Aidan, are you afraid of flying?
No.
You are so. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Lots of people are spooked by the idea of being up in the air with no visible means of support. Thanks for that description. Aidan closed his eyes and clenched his jaw. Each time he did this, he promised himself he'd try hypnosis next time. But he never remembered until it was too late, and he was headed for the airport. I've found the best remedy is distraction, Emma said. Something unrelated to flying. How about the weather? Aidan groaned. Ice on the wings. I'd forgotten about that. We could end up with ice on the wings and we'd go down like a rock. Okay, then politics. The world situation. Terrorists. On a train or a bus you have a fighting chance, but up in the air. How about my love life? We could talk about that. Aidan opened his eyes and turned his head to stare at her. You're going to tell me about your love life. See? You're already distracted. It did help to focus on her. He couldn't very well take her with him. Your love life. You know that boyfriend I told you about? Yes. He knew way more about Dougie Boy than she could imagine. We're taking a break from each other. It shouldn't have mattered to him at all, but a surge of excitement told him it mattered, all right. Since when? Yesterday. Emma, if this has anything to do with me, that's not good because because I had such a great time on Wednesday night that I realized Doug and I might not be right for each other, so I thank you for that. We needed to take a break. Look, if you're thinking we might hook up, there are several reasons why that wouldn't be a good idea. All he had to do was figure out which ones he could tell her without making her suspicious about his family. You are so right about that. What do you mean? He thought he'd have all the reasons on his side. Like you and less like Doug. That's flattering. He sincerely doubted her next lover would be physically. I can't deny that I'm very attracted to you physically, but I'm looking for. I do that. Why he felt the need to mention it was beyond him. Besides, he only left instructions for his maid to recycle it, which might not count for as much in her book. Recycling is a small thing though. The subway and flies coach someone who has to think twice before he buys a ticket to a Broadway play and has to save for months in order to afford a tropical vacation. The truth is, Aidan, gorgeous though you're too. Aidan tried to remember if any woman had said that to him in his life. No, none had. He had the impression that for most women, his money was an aphrodisiac. They liked the luxuries it could provide: exotic getaways, fine food, sensual spa treatments. He wouldn't date a woman who cared only about money, but enjoying the thrills money could buy wasn't a crime. Except to. I do believe I've shocked you, Aidan. Could be. We're airborne. He leaned past her to check that out, and sure enough they'd lifted above the layer of winter cloud suspended over New York City. Wasn't such a good idea though. Her scent filled his nostrils and he remembered the way her lips had felt pressed against his on Wednesday night. Turning slightly, he gazed into her eyes as a wave of lust moved through him. Too rich for your blood, huh? And all along I thought you were too rich for mine. With a supreme effort, he leaned back in his seat and stared straight ahead while he fought against the arousal that was making the backs of his hands prickle and his tailbone ache. Shifting at 30,000 feet would not be a good thing.